Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Chatting the Pictures. My name is Cara Finnegan, and I'm a writer, teacher, and photography historian.
And I'm Michael Shaw. I'm the publisher of Reading the Pictures.
All right, Michael, we have some legislative and congressional things to talk about this week among other images that you've snagged for us.
Yeah, that's true. We've got DC news coming from like every direction at this point. So,
Yeah. Shall we dive on in?
yep, sounds good.
All right. As folks know, our first segment we call the news, and that is where we pay special attention to the way that news photos tell a story. And here is this week's image.
This photo was taken by Kevin Lamarque for Reuters, and the caption reads, "A National Park Service ranger looks out onto the city from Trump International Hotel's historic clock tower, which remains open and staffed by the National Park Service despite the partial government shutdown in Washington, January 7th.
The iconic silhouette, I think, is the first thing that attracts me in this image. You can't not think about Smokey the Bear if you're of a certain generation, and I will say that I am. And so, I mean, Lamarck's photo does that in a couple of ways, right? It draws our attention to that because it's arranged in this kind of nice triptych where we have these three visual spaces, and then the park ranger himself is shot from the back, silhouetted. But we know he's a ranger because even without reading the caption, we recognize that hat as well. So to me, that's the first thing that jumps out. And the second thing is that his body seems a little slumped. And so there's a little body language, I think, going on here too, that this is a guy who's working, but even for folks who are working, I know there's a lot of uncertainty about what that means for them.
Yeah. Last week we were talking about that photograph of the shutdown from the EPA office and how it's maybe not so easy to get a great shot of the shutdown. And this is incredible, this photograph, because it has so much politics and so much information in it, where we see the embodiment of Trump's Trump family's special interest and privilege being demonstrated by retaining Park Service rangers from the GSA when otherwise they're all on furlough. So this photo is also an indictment and done elegantly. And when you were talking about the silhouette, I think what's also interesting, I don't know if this was like one of these tilt shift images where everything kind of goes like that. But
yeah, it looks like it almost.
It's weird. Like it's almost like the building is falling or tilted, or that this guy could fall out the window. And I don't know, like that. There's so many illusions from that. You know, it's like looking down and looking over, a big brother. All of this, you know, where this conflates the Trump and Trump family and that power with the federal worker, the anonymous federal worker.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting about that too is I was thinking about this again, the guy kind of surveying this land, and you know, partly because it's January and very many places in the northern part of the country aren't super pretty in January. You get this very bleak landscape, and it seems very empty. So, on the one hand, he is looking out over DC, and you know, clearly from a position where he's working. But on the other hand, it's a city where very, very many people are not working, and there's a lot of uncertainty. And that kind of bleakness of the landscape that he's looking out over is interesting too. This photo definitely highlights that. And two, just the darkness of it. I think, you know, again, you get the sense of the inside and the outside, but those two kind of ineffectual spotlights that are above and kind of pointed away from the ranger, I think are really interesting visual notes as well, because you get the sense of, you know, the contrast between, you know, the shutdown story and, you know, that sense of, you know, are the lights on? Is the trash piling up? You know, all of the kind of narratives, you get the sense that, okay, we're open, but it's still kind of precarious, right?
Yeah, the darkness is really interesting. And also the shapes, you get this kind of grand sense of the grand architecture. But the Trump Hotel, which is operated by the Trump organization, does lease this building from the 1899 vintage old post office from the government. But everything with Trump is always gold and gilded, and how he changed the drapes in the Oval Office and his apartment. And so in a way, the fact that there's not much gold or like kind of lights out on that too, maybe that's also kind of, maybe I'm just reading in, but maybe that's also like a commentary as well.
Yeah, it could be that sense of what's the opposite of gilded, or I get the negative sense of gilded, maybe. Yeah.
But I don't know.
Yeah, I know. We need a thesaurus here. We're visual people. What
it is getting darker though.
Yeah, exactly. So let's move on and talk about the segment that we call the look. And here we're really interested in the aesthetic components of images and how a photograph might push the visual boundaries of a story or an idea. And here's this week's image.
Okay, well, there's a lot happening in this photograph. It was taken by Martin Scholler. If you know his work, he's the one who shoots all these like really large heads for celebrities and politicians for national magazines. The photo appeared and was commissioned by Vanity Fair. It did appear in a fashion section, not a news section. The caption of the article read, "The new congressional class sets a high style bar." And then from left to right, we have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And in fact, let me just mention who each person, like kind of, because we're just getting acclimated to these new, women of the House. But Alexandria Cortez is the youngest female member of Congress in history. Ayanna Pressley is the first Black woman elected to Congress from Massachusetts. Ilhan Omar is the first Somali American, one of the first two Muslim women in Congress. Deb Haaland from New Mexico in the center is one of the first two Native American women in Congress. Veronica Escobar from El Paso is the first woman elected from the 16th district to Congress in Texas. And Sharice Davids on the far right, and she's the first openly lesbian and LGBT member of Congress from Kansas, and one of the first two Native American women in Congress. So first, and youngest. First.
Yeah. And so this is a historically significant photograph. I think sometimes when we think about things as the news and we think about news photography, we forget that. And so one of the things I think is important to mention in the midst of all of the other things we might say about this image is that this image has really historical documentary significance as a record of this particular moment in US political history. And what I think is interesting about that is when I first saw this image, I wanted to not like it as a feminist because I wanted it to be an image. I thought, oh, it's Vanity Fair, it's fashionable. They're going to be objectifying these political leaders, in terms of style, and we're going to be talking about their clothes and the way they look, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe you could embed that critique and make that argument. But to me, what was so interesting and kind of great about this group portrait of these women is that they totally look like they belong in the space that they're in. And I love that. Part of it is that they are owning their body poses, right? So they are looking right out at you. They each individually, and then I think collectively as a group, are exhibiting power in their body positioning, in the way they're looking directly at the camera, the way they're arrayed in the space. And I think that's interesting. And then also they appear to be at home in this space, which is clearly a very traditional conservative looking male space. You've got this very bureaucratic kind of federal rug that you see in the foreground. There's an image of the Capitol behind them. I don't know who the portrait of the white man is on the wall on the left, but it is definitely a portrait of a white man in
The
a suit.
Capitol's full of them.
Yeah, right. And so on the one hand, I think you could read this image saying, oh, these women of color are breaking through the male, whatever. And I think that's a totally appropriate reading of this image. But at the same time, my first response was, this is a group of powerful women leaders who belong in that space that they're being photographed in.
Yeah. When you said you were inclined not to like it, if people who've been reading the pictures for a long time know that we're just constantly harping on this political celebrity and the conflation of style and politics and personality politics. And what's amazing about this photograph, and I think it's where the media is getting very savvy too, is they're being able to embrace the depth and the content and still get tons and tons of mileage in terms of the celebrity factor. You saw that with the Nike Kaepernick ad, and here too, like you said, it's hard not to get past that. They get all their clicks, they get all their eyeballs, but there's so much more going on here, and especially given how historic the moment is. I think there's certain points where I think it really hits a wrong note, like when you talk about Omar and how incredible it is that she got a special dispensation from the Congress to wear a headscarf, and then they're framing this as a fashion article or feature, and this is, you do not want to intimate that what you're looking at is a fashion statement when you're looking at that headscarf. So that's one place where it really falls out. But in general, there's so much more going on here, and it's true, the personalities are just really come through. Presley, with the way her arms are crossed, which is both like bold and confident, but not aggressive. And then her face has a kind of a bemused look, which is so fascinating. Or the way Haaland is aligned with the Capitol, and she's Native American. I mean, oh my goodness. Now it's all about this real estate juxtaposition. She's right there kind of bisecting the couch and the only one sitting. So anchoring this photograph as a Native American, I mean, in the congressional building. I mean,
and two, there's, I think, a generational component to that as well. And I'm guessing, which may be inappropriate, but I think Haaland is the oldest of this group of women. I don't know her age. I know Presley was born in the early 70s, and as we know, Ocasio-Cortez is the youngest, right? But why I point that out is because Haaland in the middle is kind of positioned in the visual space of maybe the elder sitting down, kind of, as you said, the anchor, and then off to the left, Ocasio-Cortez is doing the pose that people of her generation do when their photograph is taken, the hand on the hip, which appears to be often the only way that women of a certain age are used to being photographed anymore. And it's not a point to ridicule her at all. I just think there's this interesting generational component that's kind of playing out in the image as well. So they're all new, they're all freshmen, and let's emphasize that freshmen kind of component, ironically. But yet each of these women has really different life experience, different age. Certainly their political interests overlap, but are also diverse in multiple ways, I'm sure. So it'll be interesting to see how the visual coverage of this congressional class plays out.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Ocasio-Cortez, and I'm really fascinated in her. We started to tweet and focus on her and kind of all the incoming now, in terms of how she's being framed, with bug eyes and all of this kind of, and then this kind of sexual innuendo that was Daily Caller, retweeted, which was, completely specious. But what's fascinating about this little segment here is that, you talk about how she's in a way shaking up the system and is really kind of so outspoken and kind of getting out in front of the seniority system and et cetera, et cetera. So there she is in front of and actually blocking the emblem of the Congress. And, it's really beautiful in how it's like really, channeling that audacity.
Yeah, and when she posted this, when her people, maybe, or her, I think it's her, posted on her Instagram feed, her caption was, "We're in the building, and tomorrow we'll be sworn in." And so that, I think, kind of hits at that too, that sense, and also ties back a little bit to my initial sense of like, this is a group of people who belong in this space. Like, we're in the building now, right? This is how it's going to be. Yeah. Shall we move on to our last image for the week?
Yep, that was fun.
So our last segment we call the pick, and this is where we think about what makes a photo a particularly good editorial choice. So why, among many options, might editors or might the public choose to focus in on particular images? And here's this week's photograph.
And this was taken by Hannah Reyes Morales for the New York Times. The caption reads, "Detainees in Manila City Jail, where most are still awaiting trial and may stay for months or even years before that happens." And I think it's helpful to know the article title, since people aren't like following the Philippines or, the Duterte, who's, seems to be kind of another like kind of person Trump's like fawning over. But the title of the article is "Where 518 inmates sleep in space for 170 and gangs hold it together."
Yeah, this image looks to me almost like an oversized history painting of another era, and in its depiction of the inhumane conditions in which people are being imprisoned, the literal bodily density that they're forced to endure, and you see this depicted really clearly in this photograph. It called to mind to me a visual analogy to a famous image from history that's known as Brooke's slave ship. And if you Google this, what you'll see is a drawing that essentially depicted the way that slaves were stored as cargo on slave ships coming from Africa, British slave ships. And what this image was used for in the late 18th century and early 19th century, it was used by abolitionists at the time to essentially visually depict the very cruel, inhumane, scientific way that humans were being stored and transported as cargo. And this image was meant to spark outrage and to get people to really see what was happening in a context where you didn't really have a chance to see that. And so the visual analogy here, there's obviously a lot of the details that are not the same, but that analogy of seeing the crowdedness, seeing the density, seeing the way an institution is treating people, to me, it was a really striking comparison.
It's funny because I wasn't familiar with, I guess I was channeling that and just kind of wasn't familiar with a lot of those images in my subconscious, because this really did strike me as the hull of a ship, like, right off the bat. So I'm glad you like kind of brought that to the surface. I mean, there's some really amazing things about this in terms of information, and then also aesthetically. I believe that if you are imprisoned, and as the caption said, a lot of people have been in this place for a year, that like if they could even appear before a judge, and even if they were convicted for a full sentence, maybe that sentence would be like a month long. So in the article they were talking about how this is just a form of torture, as opposed to anything that has any kind of an analogy or any comparison to justice. But they're also talking about this as what you can also see too is that if you have a little bit of cash, there's a hierarchy here, so that these guys in the back, actually have purchased, a little bit more room. So there's actually a hierarchy here. And then aesthetically, hate to say it, but this was on the front page of the New York Times, and we're debating whether to like talk about this in our the look category, which we felt was not really PC, but hey, look, this is a beautiful photograph, and the colors and the shapes, it's like it's kind of got this woven quality. So, it's that kind of brings up that whole issue of, the beauty of misery.
Yeah, I think so. And just um, the visual tone of it, the gold tone of the quality of the light,
Yeah.
the way the light reflects off of people's bodies, the kind of religious iconography that's off to the left. Yeah. That at first you look at it and you might think, oh, this is a group of people praying in some kind of pilgrimage setting, and then you realize, oh no, that's not, like, look at their bodies, that's not what's happening at all. The other thing I think that really punctures this image and kind of pulls you out of that aesthetic kind of wooing that it's doing is the fan on the floor that's in kind of the right or the left third of the image, and which of course just appears wholly inadequate to the job, right? And that to me is that's the one that kind of snaps you out and brings you back to the present a little bit. And then also I think highlights some of the contextual information that you were talking about, that whose fan is this? Did somebody pay to have a fan pointed at them? But yeah, you're right. And it's such a good example too of how a visual image of a story that maybe is new to a lot of readers of the mainstream media in the US can be really tricky, because you may not have enough backstory to process the visual information. And then what you're left with is this kind of ethical question of, how am I looking at this image, and what should I be taking from it?
Yeah, that's a really great point, because, this, especially with all the focus and preoccupation on, Trump and the wall and all this, like this noise, makes like our interest in, the rest of the world much more attenuated anyway. And then, you get something like this, and, context is really at premium. And by the way, one other thing I read in the article, which I thought was a really interesting point, is they were also talking about how much, and especially in a situation like this, how much sleep is a commodity. And I thought that was also a really interesting point.
Yeah, and you can imagine trying to sleep in this kind of context that's depicted in this image, and that would be utterly impossible. Okay, Michael, we are finished up for this week. The shutdown doesn't seem like it's going away. Congressional politics definitely not going away, right? We're going to be with these topics for a long time, for sure.
There's no shortage of images to look at and talk about, so I look forward to next week and seeing what else presents itself.
Exactly, and it's always fun, because we don't really know until we start pulling all these together what we will decide to highlight and to show everybody. So that's fun. We try to keep it timely.
Well, you'll also, in the meantime, watch us on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, and there's, as it happens, we're bringing it to you. All
right. And we're at readingthepictures.org, where you can also look at the replay of other CTPs if you like as well. Thanks, everybody. We will see you next time.
Take care.